And we're live. Warm welcome to everyone today to today's panel discussion titled Bending Gender, Changing Societies, Transgender Communities in South Asia. Being organized in relation to the recently passed Transgender Awareness Week and Transgender Day of Remembrance, we have with us today Dr. Jessica Hinchy of Singapore's Nanyang Technological University, and Dr. Sayan Bhattacharya of University of Maryland, College Park, and is being moderated by Swakshadip Sarkar of the University of Wellington. We regret to note that one of our participants, Sayantan Datta, will not be able to join us today due to certain health-related issues. Nevertheless, Transgender Awareness Week is a week when transgender people and their allies take action to bring attention to the community by educating the public about who transgender people are, sharing stories and experiences, and advancing advocacy around issues of prejudice, discrimination, and violence that affect the transgender community. It begins on the 13th of November each year and ends on the 20th of November, coinciding with the Transgender Day of Remembrance. The Transgender Day of Remembrance, also known as the International Transgender Day of Remembrance, has been observed annually on November 20th as a day to memorialize those who have been murdered as a result of transphobia. The day was founded to draw attention to the continued violence endured by transgender people in 1999 by a small group including Gwendolyn Ann Smith to memorialize the murder of a transgender woman, Rita Hester, in Allston, Massachusetts. This is highly pertinent as on the Transgender Day of Remembrance this very year, 2 days back, a gunman opened fire on customers and revelers at Club Q in Colorado Springs, USA, killing 5 and injuring 19 more in a bloody culmination of what can be considered the increasingly transphobic and violent rhetoric now common across conservative groups in the West. Our hearts go to Colorado Springs today and to countless others lost to hatred over the years, many of whom didn't even receive the dignity of recognition, consigned to history known only by the dead names and the past they walked away from. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by Swakshadip Sarkar. Swakshadip Sarkar is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Wellington, New Zealand. They also work with several think tanks and are the secretary of CONTO, an organization that works for the marginalized sections of society. The research interests include queer studies, migration, human rights, intersectional feminism, diversity and inclusion, law, and gender. And with that, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mihir, for a lovely introduction. So I think we should begin with the welcome speeches. So firstly, I would like to introduce Professor Sayan Bhattacharya. So Professor Sayan Bhattacharya earned their doctorate in feminist studies from the University of Minnesota in June 2022. Their current research is an ethnographic and archival exploration of various improvisatory and innovative strategies that Indian transgender communities deploy to make life in an environment saturated by violence. Shayon stages conversations between anthropologies of the everyday, transgender, queer, and critical disability studies scholarship on queer and anti-caste literatures to study the efforts needed to reproduce an everyday that can be inhabited. Their research has appeared in Radical History Review, Global Public Health, Transgender Studies Quarterly, South Asian Multidisciplinary Academic Journal, QED and GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies, amongst others. A chapter from their thesis had also won a Best Essay Award at the British Association of South Asian Studies. In a second research project, Sayan is tracking the various syncretic traditions of spirituality that is prevalent among transgender communities in Eastern India that trouble notions of the state sovereignty and religiosity. Sayan also volunteers with several community-led transgender and disability rights organizations in West Bengal in India. So, Sayan, if you could just unmute yourself and put out your opening statement, that would be great. Thank you.
Oh, I thought Professor Hinchy was going first. Thank you, Voyages into the Past, for inviting me to this conversation. And it's great to see the kind of work that you all are doing. And thank you, Swakshadip, for that introduction. So I haven't really prepared like an opening statement as such, but what I'm going to perhaps I have like a few thoughts that I thought might be pertinent for the conversation today, and that could perhaps raise some more questions. So like we are living in very paradoxical times is something that I've been thinking about, right? So Mihir just talked about the incident at Colorado Springs, and right wing, there has been a global upsurge in the kind of space that the right wing conservative forces have been getting, and the way they have been able to percolate into a lot of spaces that was kind of unthinkable in the so-called Edens of free speech earlier, right? So that is something is happening in the West. But if one looks at the context of South Asia, it's a little more complicated in the sense that the neat divisions that one is able to draw in terms of conservative forces, right-wing forces, as not amenable to thinking about trans rights in the West, doesn't neatly map on to the context of South Asia, for instance. Like if you look at the context of countries like like all the three countries, for instance, in one of the like the three countries here, for instance, Pakistan, India, as well as Bangladesh, various configurations of right wing mobilization has happened in all the three countries, right, in the last few decades. Yet the history of trans rights and trans mobilizations in these three countries have also been interesting in the way it has engaged with the right wing forces. Let's take the context of India, for instance, where the current government, and we know that it's a Hindu majoritarian government, and we know the kind of genocidal projects that it is engaged in. But the same government has also started it passed the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019. Now this act itself draws on it was passed because of the Supreme Court judgment that came out in 2014 that said that any person, irrespective of gender affirmation surgery, could basically claim their gender expression, and they were full citizens with rights, right? And the Trans Act is a much watered down version of that judgment. In the initial version of the when the bill was passed, when the bill was placed in the parliament, there were massive agitations across the country, and then the bill went through several stages because of the agitations that went across the country. So what I'm trying to point out is basically the fact that that it's interesting to note how trans movements across the country could actually also negotiate with the fascist state. If one looks at the first version of the bill and then the actual act, there has been quite a journey, in the sense that the first version of the bill actually instituted screening committees comprised of medical professionals who would be deciding if a person was trans or not, based on which the certification would be issued, and that certification was tied to welfare. But when the final act itself was passed, after all the feedback that the communities across the country, like the country, gave, um, if one wants to claim a trans certificate, then no medical intervention is required, and so an affidavit will suffice to get that certification. And it's only it's only if one wants to get M or F on their documents, that's when some proof of medical intervention is required. But even that medical intervention is kind of defined broadly. So anything from hormones to surgery could count as medical intervention. So that is an interesting moment, right? Like when we think of think of the right wing in India, one immediately goes back to the earliest articulations of queer and trans movements in India, like the film Fire, where one of most well-known leaders of the right-wing Bal his party Shiv Sena had basically vandalized halls and fire as this Western influence. And Bal Thackeray had made this famous statement that why are the protagonists, or these two women who love each other, why are these protagonists named Radha and Sita, and why are they not Razia and Sultana, right? So the transphobia was imbricated with Islamophobia always already. But then and that and the vandalizing of halls kind of became an opportunity for queer movements to get a lot of mainstream attention. Um, so a group like the Kaleri campaign for lesbian rights, they started, and then Ashwini Suttankar brought out this anthology called Facing the Mirror. So from there to today, where the right wing also acknowledges queer trans, so that it's been an interesting journey. So from the time of the fact that queerness, trans, these are Western imports, to today, where queerness and transness can be recuperated under a Hindu fold. Hinduism has always been progressive, and therefore India is a progressive liberal country, and therefore there is wider acceptance. So it's been quite a journey, right? So it kind of, so the toggling between transness, queerness as Western to homophobia, transphobia as Western, that has been an interesting journey. And in the way history, history has been constantly mobilized around that. So if one really minutely looks at trans negotiations with the state, one can actually map that kind of a journey. But even in all of this, if one really goes into the specifics of the negotiations, and that's why, like in my work, the everyday is really important. That's where a lot of fissures emerge. So, for instance, what kind of a trans body is an authentic body, legible for welfare? And not every kind of trans body can really come under the umbrella of the Hindu fold, right? So, and that becomes an important point of departure to think of like what is transness really doing to questions of the right wing. So, for instance, there was this, the Nalsa judgment. Like one of the lead petitioners of that was Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, and a very renowned Hijra activist. Now, she is also someone who is like famously gave this interview where she said that when the Balakot strikes happened, she said that she would raise a Kinnar battalion, and Indian army could actually get help from the Kinnar battalion to wipe out Pakistan. So then the patriotic Hijra body emerges, who the patriotic Hijra body as someone who also demands rights from the state, but also proudly displays their patriotism. As that has been an interesting inflection point, right? There have been interesting videos that have been circulating across various WhatsApp groups where certain Hijras in Rajasthan have been talking about how we are not befitting Hijras, we are Kinnars. So that kind of differentiation, that kind of internal divisions within communities, and there is also fierce contest, like fierce protests against this kind of attempt at Hindu mobilization that is also happening from within the communities itself. So it is not really a neat narrative of complete co-option, or nor is it a neat narrative of total disruption, is what I'm trying to say. So there is complicity, but there is also a lot of contestation. That is what is interesting to study. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting about like the sort of contestations that is going on within the community, and also when it comes in the purview of the law. So we'll get into the discussion in quite a detail. Before that, I would like to introduce Jessica Hinchy, Professor Jessica Hinchy, and so Professor Jessica Hinchy is an assistant professor in history and at Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, where she teaches gender history, South Asian history, colonialism, and slavery. Her research examines gender, sexuality, and colonialism, particularly in northern India. Her 2019 book, Governing Gender and Sexuality in Colonial India, The Hijra, circa 1850 to 1900, Cambridge University Press, examines the colonial criminalization of the Hijra community. Jessica is also interested in the history of slavery, childhood, and the family in colonial India, and more broadly in the British Empire. Recently, she has begun research on the gender and family history of low caste and Dalit communities that were labeled criminal tribes and criminalized under colonial law in British India. Jessica's research has appeared in Gender and History, Asian Studies Review, Culture Theory and Critique, and South Asian History and Culture, as well as several edited collections. So, before we get into discussion, I think it would be great if Jessica could put opening statement forward.
Sure. So thank you so much for that introduction. And I think it's also a great jumping off point to think about some of the more historical aspects, I think, of the questions that this topic raises, particularly the construction of history in that yoking of Hijras to Hindu nationalist, imaginings of the nation and of Hinduism, and also the history of making gender non-conforming bodies legible to the state, which was one of the sort of key themes of my book. So I'm going to use my 10 minutes to just say a few words about my 2019 book, which I hope will raise some questions that are relevant to the panel theme, and I think which will also really connect closely to Sayan's comments as well. So this book explored the entanglements of binary gender and colonialism through the history of the most intensified colonial project targeting the Hijra community, part 2 of the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. And before I get into that, I thought it might be useful to very briefly sketch a bit of historical background, because one of the questions that I think this theme raises is about post-colonialism, and so I think that's useful. So in the 18th century, Hijra lineages and also Patai practices were recognized by certain Indian states, which considered their Hijra subjects to be entitled to state support. And we know that the Maratha rulers recognized Hijra lineages and sometimes granted them small cash allowances or rent-free land grants. Moreover, the rulers of Awadh offered regular patronage to Hijra performers, who sometimes performed for high-ranking women of the ruling family, as Nicholas Abbott has shown. And at the same time, as we see that patronage, we also see quite ambiguous elite attitudes towards Hijras, though that's, it's something that we need to do more research on. And so, for example, the work of Ruth Vanita has talked about Urdu poetry, in which we see poets using Hijra as an insult, for example, to criticize a man for his lack of manliness, or associating Hijras with sexual promiscuity, but also positioning Hijra figures in poetry that is often involving gender play, right, and various sorts of crossings of gender positions. And so I'm really simplifying here, but to just sort of sum up what the pre-existing literature has suggested is that in the 18th century, Hijra lineages and performances received patronage from the most elite sections of society, but those same elites often described Hijras in ambiguous and sometimes negative ways. And so I think we need to think about not only the changes wrought by colonialism, of course, but also continuities across the 18th and 19th centuries. So my book is sort of showing that from the 1830s, the British began to view the Hijra community as a problem of colonial governance and a threat to colonial authority. And around the same time, in the mid-19th century, we also see changes evident in the attitudes of some Indian rulers. By the 1860s, educated Indian elites in northern India, at least, which is my region, were also writing pathologizing and criminalizing accounts of Hijras in the press. So the focus of my book is this 1871 law, the Criminal Tribes Act, Part 2, which was enforced in the northwestern provinces, so in UP and Uttarakhand. So this law targeted so-called eunuchs, and that's of course a colonial term that was often equated with Hijra, but came to encompass diverse peoples. And the Criminal Tribes Act criminalised so-called eunuchs who were reasonably suspected of sodomy, kidnapping, and castration. And that criminal suspicion was proven through feminine dress and performance. People who were deemed suspect were registered by police, prohibited from public performance or feminine embodiment. They were barred from adopting or making wills, and they were subjected to property registration. Children under 17 were also forcibly removed from registered people's households. And the explicit aim of this was to culturally eliminate the Hijra community by erasing their public presence, while causing their gradual extinction by preventing castration and initiation, which were erroneously equated. So the British saw the Hijra community as ungovernable in multiple ways, highlighting that gender and sexual disorder signaled political disorder, right, to the state. Colonial officials linked Hidra's gender expression to numerous perceived problems, including, so-called sexual deviance, obscenity and public order, the association of mobile people with criminality, discipleship-based households, which were viewed as sort of exceeding reproductive and patrilineal succession, and actually a whole host of other, sort of problems of colonial governance. And often this is viewed as sort of the importation of metropolitan British norms, right, to the colony. But that, and there is a dimension of that certainly, but that doesn't really fully explain this colonial anti-Hijra project. And instead it really emerged at the intersection of discourses that circulated within imperial networks, but also a local context with, and indeed the sort of gender and sexual politics in northern India in this time, and localized official preoccupations as well. So an important factor here is that middle class, educated, high caste, high status Indian men often backed the criminalization or even the quarantining or banishment of Hijras. And to be sure, middle-class Indian men were not preoccupied with the Hijra community to the extent that they were with other gendered and sexual issues of the day, like the so-called women's question or child marriage or prostitution. But relatively elite North Indian men portrayed the Hijra community as being kidnappers and castrators, obscene performers, and sexual deviants. So that is in a language that was quite similar to the dominant colonial narrative. But it is important that those middle-class men had shaped the ongoing construction of colonial knowledge, and their accounts were also inflected by changing class dynamics, right, within Northern Indian society too. So in my book, I sought to interrogate the history and the politics of translating Hijra into various concepts in the 19th century, including sexuality, eunuch, caste, and tribe, and then also more recently, transgender. So British officials and middle-class Indian men sexualized various Hijra practices like dress and discipleship, so that Hijras were pathologized as a type of deviant sexuality. And I sort of built on Indrani Chatterjee's argument that the process of naming something as sexual was fundamentally a process of European colonialism, but also the dynamics of elite Indian politics, and including sort of elite Indian conceptualizations of religion in the 19th century. And I showed how the eunuch category was, it obscured many social complexities, but it was also continually redone and remade as well. So the classificatory boundaries of eunuch repeatedly shifted as various people were registered and deregistered as so-called eunuchs. And those people classified as eunuchs included members of Hijra households, but also performers known as zananas, who were often femininely embodied, male devotees who wore female clothing in ritual, and also female impersonating male actors. And British administrators saw the body as a way to resolve social complexity and also to prove criminality and sexual deviance. And they sought to pin down the relationship between Hijra and other social affiliations or terms for gender by determining people's genital status or their gendered embodiment. And I think there's obviously some parallels, right? We can see to the sort of policing of the transgender category, which maybe we can talk more about later on. But I particularly emphasize that despite this sort of attempt to classify and make the body legible, that the Hijra body was frequently illegible to colonial officials. And you know, in this book, I was particularly interested in the history of the colonial archive and the politics of knowledge production, which I won't go into so much now, except to just say that we often think of the colonial archive as hegemonic and monolithic, but as with probably any archive, the colonial Hijra archive was multivocal, including multiple narratives of Hidrahood that did exceed those hegemonic colonial and middle-class Indian accounts. And so, for example, one place where I sort of teased that out was in the ways that Hidra's forms of work were recorded on police registers, which are certainly instruments of state violence, but do include these sort of fragments of people's lives, which showed that, you know, as important as performance and donation collection and, you know, Bhatai work was to Hijra communities, they were also often engaged in cultivation, agricultural labor, animal husbandry, and actually quite a like wide range of different types of work as well. And so just to sort of like sum up this 19th century context, I really sort of emphasized in this book that the governance of registered people was locally varied. And this was partly because, you know, colonial governance at the local level was varied, and the colonial police was like a very fractured institution. And of course, that could actually exacerbate state violence, right? That the sort of fissures or weaknesses in colonial authority actually often enabled and in some senses fueled colonial police violence, against Hijras, but it also enabled evasion as well. And so criminalized people very much sort of shaped the contours of colonial policing and surveillance. They evaded police. They carved out spaces for prohibited performance and for prohibited forms of dress and embodiment. They often sort of creatively mixed masculine and feminine clothing to try to evade the prohibition on women's forms of clothing, and they initiated new disciples as well into lineages. And so, as we know, Hijras and other gender non-conforming people survived that colonial project of elimination. But I was also interested in complicating narratives of a sort of complete colonial disjuncture by highlighting the complex connections between the colonial and post-colonial governance of the Hijra community. Notwithstanding the considerable impacts of colonialism, we really can't explain the post-colonial sort of present simply as a colonial legacy, right? And that's the case on, I think, multiple levels, including, and if we're talking more about my sort of my research in terms of, you know, the criminalization and police harassment and other forms of legibility to the state that Hijras and other gender non-conforming people experience. And so in the postscript, I talked about how a version of Part 2 of the Criminal Tribes Act eventually ended up in the police acts of some states in post-colonial India, particularly in some southern states, highlighting some very clear legal continuities. But I also showed that the resonance of colonial policing with the with a lot of policing and legal projects in contemporary South Asia is not simply a matter of colonial inheritance. And those echoes between the colonial and the post-colonial reflect the tendency of modern states to view non-normative gender, sexuality, and intimacy as disorderly, and therefore as a threat to visions of the state as a guarantor of social order. But I think there's also, there's a lot of factors that go into explaining, I think, the sort of post-colonial history of heteros and trans communities and gender non-conforming people in South Asia and their interactions with the state. And, I can't really summarize them all here, and it's also not my area, but I think just to reiterate that sort of like complexity of historical change is something I was trying to get at in the book. So I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think that was a great introduction into the Criminal Tribes Act and how it sort of had an effect and continues to have an effect on the gender variant communities in South Asia. So since you began talking a bit about the history, so there are very common narratives that are actually being used by right wing, as Shayan mentioned, that like gender variant people or specifically hijras were like very much accepted in pre-colonial India. So like we need to sort of introducing them back into like the sort of like claiming that that gender variant people are sort of like a part of the Hindu society, as the right wing successfully claims. So so how far do you think that is true? Like are there different shades of acceptance in pre-colonial India, or yeah, this is a question to Jessica.
Okay. Well, and perhaps we can both maybe speak to this as well. But yeah, I mean, I should say I'm a historian of the 19th century, right? So I'm also, in that sense, not the person to give a complex answer to that. And in some ways, my answer to that is actually more about, I think, the ways that history is used in the present, and of course, constructions of the history of religious traditions, right? And Hinduism in particular. So, I mean, I think, as I said, there has been some historical work done on the 18th century, which is quite sort of, I think, can be pushed further, right? Which does sort of give us a sense of like, yes, patronage and importance of like hetero performance in certain spaces. In terms of like longer questions of continuity and the idea that I really think that we've got to be critical about how history is used in the present, right? And who that marginalizes. And so I think that's my main answer to that question. But I would say, in terms of like the colonial dimension of this, like I am also aware that, like my book is examining this colonial history, which I think is important to understanding the present, but also can't explain everything in the present. And, framing transphobia in the present as only a colonial legacy feeds into those narratives that you mentioned, right? Of, the idea of Hinduism in particular, I mean, in the Indian context, right, in a Hindu nationalist construction, Hindu right construction, as being historically accepting of gender variance. I mean, that, that colonial history can be yoked to that, right? And so I think it's also important to like contextualize that colonial history in a way that doesn't feed into that narrative as well.
Yeah, I think I think it definitely does matter, like how we use how we use the historical constructions at present. And Yeah, so I think from there I would like to draw the conclusion about like how sort of the uh, the narrative is changing, like from like as like Shan mentioned, how the narrative is changing from viewing like trans people or gender variant people or the LGBTQ plus community in general as like un-Western import, from like sort of reintroducing it to the very, like a core Hindutva narrative. Like if you could like probably talk a bit on that, Shayan, that would be great.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Yeah. It's just so great listening to Jessica, and like the thing that comes up again and again is right, like that it's not been really seamless. It's not been like some kind of a smooth transition from acceptance to rejection or vice versa, right? Like there have the formations are like constantly in flux. So I mean, we could let's take a few contradictory for things that have happened in the recent past, and kind of to go back to your question about how the narratives are constantly shifting. The political space, and by political space I mean electoral politicals. The electoral politics is a great, I think it's a great barometer of how the narrative shifts, is ever shifting. So, and the state of Maharashtra has been very important in that sense, because, like as I mentioned, Bal Thackeray, uh, and now the state of Maharashtra is also where anti-caste discourse has really been right, like has been really prominent, and thanks a lot also due to translations and how it, because of translations it circulates. So recently. Right, like the Maharashtra government was this loose assemblage of different shades of right, like so there was Shiv Sena, and there was the Congress, and there was the National Congress Party. Now that government, what was it called, Vikas Aghadi, they were they were recently toppled because a huge chunk of Shiv Sena shifted, uh, and then BJP came to power. So during this time, a statement that Bal Thackeray had made started circulating again, so much so that it was being widely circulated on mainstream media and across all the Hindi channels. So Bal Thackeray had made this statement that a right-wing party like Shiv Sena can never support, can never go with Congress, because Congress is a party of hijras, because it bows before Sonia Gandhi, who is a foreigner, right? Like, and so a party that who accepts Western import as their leader is a party of hijras. So that statement was being again resurrected by members of the BJP, like Eknath Shinde and several others, that look what has happened to Shiv Sena after Bal Thackeray dies. So the patriotic raw masculinity of Shiv Sena has been totally emasculated, and they are a party of hijras now because they're siding with Congress. And so it is time to again reclaim the masculinity of the party, and that is why it has to break away from the Congress, right? So it has been interesting to note how the breakaway groups of Shiv Sena have not joined the BJP. They are calling themselves that they are the Shiv Sena, whereas the other side, Uddhav Thackeray, Bal Thackeray's son, and they are the ones who are not male enough. Now, this kind of a conversation is happening precisely at the moment where the BJP ruled central government Yeah, I think I froze for a moment. Yeah. Sorry, my internet is a little choppy today. So this kind of this resurrection of the party of hijras is happening exactly at the time when the BJP is also passing the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. And not only is it passing that act, but it is also saying that kinnars have been, and it's very interesting to note that they are repeatedly harping on kinnar and not necessarily hijra, because of the roots of the word hijra. It's Persian roots, whereas kinnar supposed to be the Sanskritized version, right? So they're saying that they have been part of our culture, and therefore, but the language is one of rehabilitation. It is not of rights, right? So if one reads the Transgender Persons Act, then one will note that these are people who have been discriminated, and but they have been in our epics for a long time, therefore they need protection. And so what I'm trying to say is that the way the right wing reads the trans body as the kinner, um, it cannot be. It is in the light of divinity, in the sense that it is not the sexual body. It is the body which is present in Hindu mythology as a spiritual, as almost a spiritual figure, and therefore a body which, because it was discriminated, needs to be rehabilitated. And therefore they have set up these garima grihas, like the shelter homes across the country. And if one goes through the rules of like the idea of the garima griha, like homeless trans people can find shelter here for up to a year, but they are supposed to be given vocational training, skill building, and that is how they can be rehabilitated into the mainstream, in the sense that give up the unsanitized professions of sex work, begging, and become respectable citizens as full citizens of the country, right? So that idea, the Hindu caste idea of purity and pollution, make make their entry to the language of the Trans Act, where the language of rehabilitation, vocation building, skill building, and so the Hindu state is not really giving up on its ideas of purity and pollution. And Jessica's book talks a lot about contagion, right? So that kind of the idea of the contagion makes like is strongly evident across the legal text. And the idea of garima griha, right, like garima, pride, dignity. And so the hijra, the kinnar becomes dignified through skill building, and therefore stay away from the fleshly professions, right, like sex work, dancing, and all of that, and become respectable citizens. So you see the multiple kind of mobilizations of transness that's happening. So the phobia has not really disappeared, but the phobia also morphs into discourse around rehabilitation. So that has been really interesting to study. Now, this is also happening simultaneously when a lot of right-wing queers who went to court recently after the Section 377 verdict came. He said that now that Section 377 has been decriminalized, now it is time for us to get marriage rights. So there were petitions, right? The petitions have been filed. Now, in that, the Tushar Mehta, the Solicitor General representing the state, kept saying that marriage is sacred, and therefore it cannot be extended to all kinds of people, right? So far as the family form is being concerned, that is not getting disrupted. So that still continues to be the heteronormative family, which is supposed to reproduce caste, right? And so then not all kinds of bodies can be included within the idea of the family. So as much as queers would really love to believe that there is that the right wing fully accepts and integrates us, so there are limitations to that framework as well, like given the like absolute resistance to questions of marriage that keeps coming up, and so it's really complex in terms of, so that there is a certain discourse around transness through rehabilitation, through ideas of purity, and then there is the disappearance of sexuality. So you have the privacy to practice your intimacies within the confines of the four wall, but marriage is something that is supposed to make your sexuality public. That cannot happen, because marriage can only be heteronormative, and it is only supposed to reproduce caste. Those are the kind of limitations, as well as ruptures that are happening, I feel.
I think the entire idea that marriage is sacred and marriage is heteronormative, or like it also very much, like comes from the colonial narratives uh, around like marriage and family. So like if Jessica could speak a bit on like like whether the since she talked about how sort of like history is being used in the present. So if you could talk a bit about like the Criminal Tribes Act and like how does it actually like still continue to affect the Indian laws and judicial system, since we do know like the colonial laws like did have a lot of effect on modern Indian laws as well. So
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there's many dimensions to that. I mean, I think also, these sort of like in terms of like rehabilitation and how the 2019 law was framed or is not about rights, right? And is within this frame of rehabilitation and work. I mean, I think it's also just quickly on that, like it's quite notable in the 19th century archives that I look at that people who are classified as eunuchs, right, often heteros, but also people who are, gender non-conforming in some way, they commonly were doing performance and what was termed begging and cultivation or animal husbandry or something else, right? And so I think to that like division of productive, unproductive work, like, I mean, we've only got fragmentary sort of archives, but that itself is obviously a statist sort of classification, but it's also something that emerges out of those sort of 19th century political economic structures as well, right? So and of course in the 19th century this project is framed as one of elimination, and obviously the rehabilitation project such as it is framed quite differently and ostensibly more in terms of assimilation. But I think then that raises the question, right, of like assimilation for whom and to what as well, right? So and of course who does that so-called rehabilitation sort of marginalize. But in terms of kinship and family and marriage are really sort of central to the Criminal Tribes Act, like Part 2, and in quite a few ways. So I mean, the non-recognition of heterodiscipleship and kinship is really central to that 1871 law, which involved the registration of property, and of course the removal of children who are under 16 or under from the households of criminalized people. And as I said, that was an explicitly sort of eliminationist project. So and in addition to that, of course, heterokinship is sort of framed as being criminal, and hence the kidnapping and castration sort of discourse, right? Which I do sort of historically unpack and very much problematize in my book. So that non-recognition of heterokinship, I think, is really important. And of course, you see that in that 2019 law. I do think, though, I think we need more historical work actually on the 20th century, which might sound a bit odd because, of course, we need more historical work prior to the 19th century as well. But there's been such an emphasis on the second half of the 19th century in the existing historical work that we've only, like, historians only have a pretty patchy sense of actually the sort of more fine-grained history of those legal change, continuities and changes, but also then, of course, how they actually impact upon hetero communities and more broadly on gender varied people. So, there are these really clear continuities, and I think one of them is this non-recognition, right, of forms of kinship that are not patrilineal, that are, not based on reproductive and heterosexual sexualities as well. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question there, but
yeah, I think that fully answers the question. So, moving on, I think Sharon did talk a lot about NALSA and Transgender Act, and Jessica did as well. So, so my next question is to you both. How do you view NALSA and the Transgender Act from a post-colonial lens? Is it trying to uphold the colonial nations are doing gender or disrupt it?
Who would you like to speak first?
Uh, Anyone who wants to go first
Okay.
can.
I guess I can. I mean, this is obviously not my main area of research, so I can only really sort of speak in a general way. I mean, I think my interpretation has been that I wouldn't say that it disrupts colonial notions of gender, certainly. And I mean, I think in terms of a form of recognition for transgender people, that is, in terms of making them and their bodies as well legible to the state, to me, the 2019 Act didn't uphold that. The right to gender self-determination under the NALSA ruling, and I know the NALSA decision, there were many issues with, right, that a lot of scholars and activists have highlighted, but it did establish a right to gender self-determination and rights to dignity and and to bodily autonomy for trans people. And the 2019 Act, although there were changes in, the very long process of that being legislated, in terms of the sort of bureaucratic policing of the transgender category, in terms of, requiring approval by the district magistrate, which I believe, endured into the 2019 Act, and then also the rules that were set up in 2020 as well for its implementation. And that, approval for the district magistrate was required for recognition as transgender, but then for recognition as male or female, of course, proof of gender confirmation surgery or some medical procedure was required, right? So I think just in terms, that's it's, of course, it's a difficult question, right? Like, how can people seek the recognition and the identity, the recognition of their identity that they need from the state in order to live, right? Is sort of like the basic question, because of course it, not being recognized by the state according to your gender expression and identity is, it has real material impacts, right? But the way that the state is recognizing people's gender identities is, very much in terms of policing the boundaries of these gender categories, right? And often in sort of medicalized ways, or in terms of like requiring a psychologist certificate, which I believe was introduced under some 2020 rules that were drawn up. But I haven't been following that as closely, so I don't know to the extent to which that was implemented. And I mean, in terms of not recognizing kinship relationships, right, as well, that are outside of like a, heterosexual conjugal household as well, is a really important dimension of that law. I mean, as many, I'm just sort of like repeating what many have said before me, but like, many activists and also pointed out that what am I trying to say? The punishment for sexual abuse against transgender people was set at a much shorter term than the punishment for rape against cisgender women under the Indian Penal Code, right? The limitations of the welfare measures, etc. So, I mean, I think in terms of that, making bodies and people legible to the state, I see some real continuities, which are maybe not just directly in terms of like literally the content of the law, but in terms of how the state tries to govern, right, gender variability. So in that broader sense, right? But that's sort of the way I would come down on that question.
Shayan, if you want
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. Of course, when one looks at the Transgender Persons Act, then definitely the NALSA verdict appears far more progressive, right? So that is definitely now, but the verdict itself, this 150-page ruling, was basically a strange piece of document, given that it was full of contradictions. So, for instance, on one hand, there were these very lurid paragraphs about describing about, like, the trans body. So there was this very medicalized understanding of the trans body, but then on the other hand, it kept harping on that any person should have the right to gender expression, irrespective of any kind of medical intervention. So there was this tension that was there around a medicalized understanding of trans versus self-expression. But in the final word, of course, like, it really harped on self-expression, which was watered down in the act, right? So in that sense, it doesn't really disrupt in the writing of the judgment. It doesn't necessarily disrupt the colonial inheritances, but perhaps in the judgment, like the actual ruling that any person should have the right to gender expression, it kind of does that work. Um, Another interesting aspect of it was also the fact that, in its understanding of trans, trans and hijra were used interchangeably, uh, and so it was not necessarily inclusive of the various configurations of trans, right? So, for instance, in the judgment, trans masculinity was something that was almost missing, and a lot of transmasculine activists and academics have written about it, that what are the problems of thinking of trans and hijra interchangeably, and how it kind of completely misses the specificity of of transmasculine individuals. And also, to constantly harp on the medicalized idea of transness, it was also somewhere mixing up between intersex and trans. And so there was a lot of basically, it kind of created more questions than it actually answered. But in that kind of an ambiguous space, there was a lot of scope for creativity in terms of how what are the lives of law, right? Like, it depends on individual district magistrates and their negotiations with activists and all of that. So that kind of room was there. So between 2014, when the judgment was passed, and 2019, when the act was passed, several people have just been able to get their certification through a simple affidavit because of their activist connections through NGOs, and there are several other narratives as well, where they have been forced to go through medical examination. So the judgment itself was being interpreted widely in very contradictory ways, which kind of got a little hardened with the passage of the act. But for me, the most significant aspect of the NALSA verdict was the question of reservation. In the judgment, it was mentioned that trans people should be able to avail of reservation in education and in employment through the OBC category, right? Other backward classes category. So it was interesting to see how caste marginality and gender marginality were almost being made equivalent, which is, of course, very problematic because both have very specific histories with intersections, of course. But the point of reservation is very important. So in some ways, because many of the working class trans communities also are, they come from oppressed caste backgrounds, right? So there is definitely that overlap. But so that that question of reservation was really important. And that was taken up by a lot of trans groups. And there was a certain more like an almost like a gesture of futurity in there, that by claiming a certain backwardness, you can have a future, you can have a vision of futurity, where trans people, by claiming backwardness, can actually become full citizens, right? So that was an interesting narrative that was emerging. Now, of course, in the Trans Act, as we know, question of reservation was completely left aside, and it was repeatedly brought up in feedback, and to the standing committee that was constituted to get feedback around the bill. But and if one looks at the meeting minutes of some of these of the standing of the various standing committees, it often says that caste groups have strongly objected to the inclusion of trans within the OBC category, without really specifying which caste groups have really objected to thinking of trans in reservation. So that also kind of shows the attitude of the state on matters of reservation, right? And given the huge casteist backlash that questions of reservation have been receiving in the country, of course, right through the Mandal Commission years, but also much more aggravated now. Um, uh, it kind of so it kind of actually makes sense that the state will be anti-reservation so far as trans is concerned. Now, here also there is an interesting tension to which is very, very important to mark, right? Dalit trans activists have been agitating about that there cannot simply be a blanket reservation for trans people, given the fact that within the trans also there are very people from various caste backgrounds, and marginality, of course, amplifies even further for oppressed caste trans persons. So someone like the Dalit activist, like Dalit trans activist Grace Banu, talks about the demands, talks about horizontal reservations. So within the various caste categories, there should be reservations for trans. And that kind of a debate about horizontal reservation has resonances in the question of women's reservation, right? So, like when women's reservation was being implemented through during the panchayat elections, one noticed that it was mostly the dominant caste men who lost their seats because of reservation. They got their daughters and wives to contest. So the women kind of became the proxy candidates in the and kind of held on to the caste capital, right? So nothing was being disrupted, and so OBC and Dalit leaders have talked about horizontal reservations, caste-based reservations in the women's reservation question as well. So that kind of a debate also resonates so far as the question on reservation for trans is concerned. Now, while these debates are happening, and while the Supreme Court judgment talked about reservation, that state absolutely refuses to entertain any questions of reservation around transness. And around the same time, it is very significant to note the recent Supreme Court verdict around reservation upholds the reservation for economically weak sections, right? So, in a way, the quote unquote general category, like which is the dominant caste, oppressive caste category, they kind of make enter reservation through the question of poverty. So the state basically kind of upholds reservation for the dominant, the ones who've held cultural capital for centuries, whereas the reservation for the oppressed caste gets diluted, and the state refuses to, of course, entertain any questions on reservation for trans people.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like how these different, these very different and very contradictory contestations are coming into place when we talk about trans rights, and specifically in the purview of law. So, like just moving on a bit, I would really like to ask, like uh, since we know, we are living in a world where Western forms of knowledge production is being dominant, at least in a post-colonial world. like uh, how do you think Western imperialism affects rights of transgender people in India or gender variant people in India? Does it try to place a group of gender variant people at hierarchy and further marginalize others? What are your opinions on this? Shan, if you could answer this.
Yeah. I would love to hear Jessica's thoughts on this as well. But I think, and it's a very important question, right? And now again, here it is kind of a very, I think the response can only be ambivalent in the sense that no kind of colonization is ever complete, right? There's always some kind of contradiction and disruption within that. So if one looks at contemporary trans queer mobilizations in South Asia, it has been very extremely dominated by funding politics. And in the 90s, post like in the 90s when the HIV crisis was peaking, various transnational donor bodies, IMF, World Bank, and the various foundations like the Bill Gates Foundation were um, kind of donating on HIV advocacy, and because of which many various nonprofits mushroomed across the country. Now, funding imperatives also entailed the creation, like they would decide like which is the vulnerable category that requires intervention, right? So if one looks at some of the early documents of the policy papers of the National AIDS Control Organization, NACO, and their policy papers, then it starts with which are the vulnerable categories. And so for a long time, they did not recognize gender nonconformity at all, right? So it was mostly the sex workers and the IDUs, basically, who were categorized as the most vulnerable.
I think we lost Cheyenne again. I think,
Yeah, sorry, I froze
yeah.
again. Then MSM makes an entry, right? Men who have sex with men. That was the term that was being circulated. And so then what? And then after MSM, it was Koti, and then Koti versus MSM. Then trans makes an entry in the NSCP 3, I think, in Tier 3. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the transnational donor bodies decide which is the most vulnerable category, and then uh, what that means is that community based organizations across the country will have to actually do the labor of becoming legible to receive funding. So then someone who would not even have an idea of this kind of an identity term will have to actually use that term now to be eligible for funding, because otherwise how do you prove that you're vulnerable, right? So that's a top down intervention that is happening, right? So and but in that process, so then that whole thing about what is international, what is national, and what is local. But then in that process, the local also does not get completely subsumed under the international also, right? So for instance, community-based organizations, volunteers there, while they have to do the labor of translating transgender in their fields, they also resignify what trans could mean. So then what trans means in a global context does not necessarily it would mean that would not necessarily neatly map onto what it means in a so-called local context, right? So like Ani Dotto writes about this process as vernacularization, where meanings are made across multiple scales. But at the same time, it is also a politics of language, because in what language do the words circulate? So then and how do they get translated? So there are multiple questions here, and in making new meanings, disrupting established meanings, in mistranslations, fissures are created. but that point of like an imposition is it's a constant question that one has to grapple with. So for instance, right now, a term that's circulating a lot, right, like the term non-binary, it's a term that is also circulating a lot in South Asia at the moment. It was not necessarily circulating so much earlier, right? So gender non-conforming was being used. A group like Sampurna, which is a group for transmasculine individuals, they were using the term intergender. So there have, but non-binary seems to be a term that is circulating a lot, and then there is again there is this kind of response to that, as that, oh, non-binary is also a Western import, and how do we disrupt that, right? So then again, that kind of an oppositional discourse is also there. But what is important to note here is that a lot of people, often with very privileged access to capital, with caste capital, cultural capital, they use these terms to identify themselves. And so these terms have already they are already circulating, and these terms are also circulating outside of metropolitan context. So we cannot really think of the periphery as this romanticized space of decolonization, where the local term is the term of absolute resistance, because these terms are also kind of circulating outside of the metropole. But then these terms are also being reconfigured and being refashioned, even as the so-called local terms continue to circulate. So a person could be non-binary and Koti simultaneously. A person could be both hijra and transgender, transfeminine simultaneously. So there is a lot of movement across multiple directions.
If I could just answer that question quickly, I mean, I think that pretty much said it all, but it was such a great and fleshed out answer. But I think, I think the question that strikes me, and this is like, of course, coming to this as a historian and reading like all the excellent work that's been written about this question, particularly like the geopolitics of translating transgender and so on, and also, of course, the geopolitics of like the NGO sector and its intersection with the state, or interaction with the state as well. I mean, it strikes me that it's sort of a question of how those broader global geopolitics then intersect or interrelate with class and caste hierarchies, and then also minoritization, right? And how does all of that sort of interact with each other? And I think too, just to sort of add on to that question, I think, like I know many people have also been thinking about like, how do we think about that in that question in the context of the scholarship we produce as well, right? Which is obviously plugged in with, with, I mean, global circulations of capital and like the structures of universities, and then of course also like the I guess the ways that scholarship represents and translates, right? And I don't just mean that in terms of translation into like English language scholarship, though that's part of it, but also those questions of translation that are somewhat broader, like how do we translate to an audience of our scholarship, and particularly talking beyond South Asia as well. Like I think about this in terms of how, for example, hijra histories can get sort of often included as some sort of like exemplary Asian history example in trans history discussions, right? And I know like a lot of historians who work on what we might say, I mean, these terms, again, we're constantly choosing different terms, right, to try to translate, right? But the ways that gender variability in Asia is then sort of incorporated within the field of trans history is something that I think is important to think about. I know Howard Chiang, who works on China, has written in several places about how like books on South Asia or East Asia are always marked as, governing gender and sexuality in colonial India, right? Whereas trans history books that have been written about the US or Western Europe don't have those geographical markers, right? As if they stand in for all trans histories. So there's that dynamic. But then I think there's also the question that, you know, of how those sort of geopolitical structures then relate to, class and caste hierarchies, of course, and it, you know, as well. So yeah, anyway, that's just a few additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think at the moment, what's really relevant is how sort of, like the, for example, if we consider the Stonewall riots, like how it is considered a part of trans history or queer history, that, uh, that sort of like started the gay rights movement around the world. But we aren't often really aware about the history of other countries or other nations. Well, where probably, like the queer liberation or the trans liberation movement has been going on since before that. So yeah, I think that is a very interesting observation from my side. Uh, Basically, going into that detail, since like we are talking about the Western narratives, so uh, the Trans Day of Remembrance specifically is to remember the trans people who faced violence, or who were murdered during the last year. So every year we see statistics regarding trans people getting murdered in the US, but we don't see a similar sort of statistics in India. So, do you think like the ground situation in India is different from the US, or and do you feel that we need such a statistics to also, like sort of uh, like portray, like the condition or that trans people live in, in the country? Also, like how would it be useful for policy making in general? My question is to Shayan.
Yeah. So the question of statistics is definitely important. Uh, Given, so if one looks at, for instance, the Supreme Court verdict in the Kaushal, which was, I think, which year was that? 2013, where the Supreme Court basically overturned the Delhi High Court judgment of Section 377 and said that it is not in its purview to read down. And there it made this observation that the LGBT community is a minuscule minority, and therefore the kind of evidence that were being placed before it in terms of the violations that it had faced because of Section 377 did not really read as tangible form of human rights. While that it did not, it wasn't quantifiable enough for the Supreme Court to take note, and therefore to decriminalize it, right? So to in that and so the reactions to that was, the immediate reaction to that judgment was to try and compile data around the kind of violations that the LGBT communities were facing. And so right after that, right to information, like, petitions were being filed across the country to basically tabulate the number of arrests that had happened, or the kind of in custody torture that was happening. But what was interesting was that often information was not forthcoming, right? Like, so a lot of these arrests did not really happen. So how do you quantify, how do you tabulate persecution if the blackmail or if the torture is happening in a public space and money is being exchanged to get out of trouble? Then that doesn't become a statistic, but it's still violation, right? So then that also exposes the limits of tabulation. um, so ultimately, when the Johar judgment came, if one looks at all the petitions that were being made, it was around question of citizenship, it was around question of dignity, and it was around question of even meritocracy. The IIT petition was about like, we are all meritorious citizens of the country, but we are being persecuted because of our sexuality. So it was not really about the statistic, right? So it was based on citizenship and almost like caste capital. Now, since you brought up the question of US, yeah, in US also, like, even if there is a lot of statistics, that doesn't necessarily really lead to the decrease in the number of murders, because it is also about the political will, it is also about ideology, and and in the case of the US, it is also a question of racism and anti-blackness, because trans women of color, black trans women, and indigenous trans women are like trans people across the spectrum, including trans masculine individuals, they are far more susceptible to violence and torture compared to their white counterparts. So then gender and race are like closely imbricated, right? So and similar, like in our context as well, varied forms of marginality also are very important, like the hijras and the trans sex workers, many of whom are from oppressed caste backgrounds, are far more susceptible to violence. But I would say that it cannot be seen as a standalone. Like, for instance, we don't have enough statistic about the number of suicides that happened during the pandemic, irrespective of gender, right? So, and like one, for instance, talks about farmer suicides, but do we have a breakup of the caste of the farmer suicides? Or we talk about student suicides, but do we have enough breakup in terms of the caste background of the students? We don't, right? So there is lack of data around it. But then we all know that there are histories of oppression, and that kind of feed directly into the question of which are the bodies that are far more vulnerable. Now, important thing to note here is that because the trans communities have not really counted as a vote bank, right? Haven't really counted as a sizable number of a population, and therefore often atrocities against trans people do not count as atrocities, right? They do not make it to the papers. And the reason why that counting does not happen are also sometimes because of one's livability, right? Like, if my livability depends on me going under surveillance, as in avoiding surveillance, then I will not choose. Like, if a census official comes to my place and I live in a home in a situation which is extremely transphobic, then I might not want to be legible as trans, right? So, and if I do not come out as trans, then I do not become a number, right? So there are a lot of uh, uh, strategic negotiations which are also about being able to survive. It is about survivability. So that counting is also double edged, like, who can count as trans and who cannot count as trans, right? So sorry. So it is the counting is a very ideological question as well, right? In a caste-based society, do I want to appear as who I am all the time, is a question that requires some reckoning before we can think about statistics.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with like, it's not just about the numbers, but also about the sort of narratives that like that lead to these like violence. So since you talked quite a bit about like recognition and politics of recognition, so like what are the current barriers that you feel trans people face in getting themselves recognized as transgender under the court of law? Because like uh, because in a system of like nationhood and statehood, like like it is necessary to be recognized by the state rather than just recognizing yourself at times in order to be recognized and like avail the sort of like the benefits of nationhood or statehood as a trans person. So like what do you think are the current barriers for getting like recognized as a trans person? Jessica, you can also weigh in if you want. Yeah. I think Sharon is muted.
Yeah. Do you want to go first, Shayan, and then I'll if I've got anything to add, I'll jump in.
Uh, okay. So just before I kind of respond to this question, I wanted to add something that just came to my mind. Like, so, like given the limitations of surgery, that's why the question of memory really becomes important, right? So when you're talking about the Trans Day of Remembrance, it's very striking to see how trans people hold on to the memories of those who have passed on. If the state is not recognizing me, and if the state does not, if violence doesn't register as violence, it is the memories in the way of memories of those who continue to keep circulate that kind of holds on to the idea that someone lived and had a full life, right? So that is, I think, very important. Now, coming back to that question of recognition, like recently, the West Bengal government, for instance, just circulated the rules that would be necessary to implement the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act. And various states have already circulated the rules. West Bengal was one of the few last states to circulate its rules. Now, if one looks at the rules that are being circulated across the country, one notes that the legacy papers become really very important, which is to say that like you have to prove your residence in a particular place for at least 6 months or more to be eligible to get that trans certificate. So even before you reach the district magistrate or the district court, you have to prove that
Yeah, I think Sharon will be back in a bit, in a minute or
yeah.
so. Yeah,
Yeah,
please
I'm
proceed.
back again. Some ghostly, some trans ancestor is playing. Um, the legacy papers becomes the biggest challenge. Like this proving your residence. Like if I have left home, or if the home was so transphobic that I left, and I'm living elsewhere, or if I'm a hijra who moves from, or if I'm, say, a dancer who dances at weddings across the various states, then I'm moving from different locations. It could be because of livelihood, I'm migrating. It could be because of safety reasons. So I might not be able to prove my residence. So then, would I not get the trans certificate? So that becomes the biggest challenge, even before we reach the stage of affidavit, district magistrate, medical professionals. Of course, like those are also, the bureaucracy is of course a big issue, but in the very way citizenship is configured, it is very normative. And we saw that happen when the agitations around the National Register of Citizens was happening around the NRC, and trans communities were also participating in the agitations against NRC, because this question of demanding papers is also it's a deep trans issue. So for instance, in the state of Assam, where NRC was implemented, amongst the 19 lakh individuals who lost citizenship, 2000 people were trans. And these were also, it's very important to note that these were the people who who openly asserted themselves as trans. So imagine, what about those people who did not, right? So these people also lost their citizenship, and a petition was filed by the trans activist Swati Vidhan Barua about that we cannot be showing like proof of residence. So that is, I think, a very important factor to keep in mind. And this kind of surveillance is only increasing with Aadhaar, with like biometric surveillance. Um, this way of getting access to welfare only by becoming legible through stability through residential stability, or through various modes of like documentation, is a big challenge for trans folks.
Jessica, if you wanna weigh in.
I mean, I guess just to quickly, I mean, this is sort of like an obvious point, of course, but I mean, the endurance of registration, right, as a technique of governance, I think, across the, second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. And I mean, is something that strikes me there. But I think, yeah, that proving continuity of residence and the ways that, legibility to the state is entwined with mobility and sedentariness and so on is really important there. But yeah, I think that sort of gave a really sort of interesting answer to your question there. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are almost running a bit over time. So this will be my last question. So since we talked quite a bit about caste and religion, do you think like intersectionally marginalized trans people in terms of caste, class, religion, or disability are being recognized in India and at present? And if they're not, what are the struggles they're facing at present, especially in terms of the intersectionality? This question is to you both. Whoever wants to go first.
Jessica, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I would probably have more of an answer, of course, that's a little bit more historical. I mean, I guess I've sort of been thinking about that question in terms of the sort of the hetero studies literature, I guess, and both historical and non-historical as well, and the sorts of intersections, as you put it, that have been more visible within that literature or less visible, right? And I think, that the field, like from anthropology, from sociology, linguistics, history, etc., has done a sort of quite good job of talking of thinking about class and caste and religion and how they intersect in terms of I mean, especially the questions we were talking about before about citizenship and and sort of the terms in which heteros and trans people are included in the nation as well. But I've realized more recently that I had not at all engaged with, not sufficiently, certainly engaged with disability studies or crit theory, and also had not engaged with questions of aging as well, which when I then re-looked at my archival materials, sort of were everywhere, especially questions of aging, actually, and old age. And so I think that's something that is, I mean, it's not really an answer to your question, but I think it's something that to think more about as well as how those intersections of gender and sexuality and caste and religion are also age structured in certain ways as well, right? And I think that's interesting to think about, in terms of like some of the questions of kinship and discipleship we were talking about before too. So yeah, I'll probably leave it there. But that's something I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, the question of intersection is obviously vital, right, when we think of trans rights, and it kind of goes back to the question of which is the trans body that is eligible for any kind of recognition in the state, and there that question of purity becomes the central point, right? Like the state would want to rehabilitate, and the mode of rehabilitation happens that through that vocation, as well as criminalizing sex work and begging, right? So if one looks at and it is directly tied to questions of caste, because who are the trans sex workers and who are the ones who are begging? Most of them, and historically speaking, they have been mostly coming from oppressed caste backgrounds, and the question of sex work is deeply it's a caste based question. And so it is no different for female sex workers and trans sex workers when we think of sex work and caste together. And so this whole idea of purity is a Hindu caste-based societal idea. And so if one looks at the Trans Act, it says that, like, when it talks about rehabilitation, it criminalizes hijra households and to centralize the heteronormative family. So a minor, if they do not find a safe space in their heteronormative household, in their natal family, would be rehabilitated by the state by putting them in some kind of a state home. And then the question of that nobody can be forced into begging, so almost implying that the hijra household is basically the one which is forcing the minor into begging. So in that way, it like criminalizes hijra households, like it criminalizes like years of these alternate kinship modes that have been really spaces where a lot of folks have found home. Not to say that they have been absolute safe havens, because of course it's complicated and it has its own structures of oppression as well, but still it did provide a durable form of kinship, which is now being criminalized by the state, right? So then it is very important to look at that intersection. And of course the Islamophobia, and that operates in tandem with the casteism, um, in terms of dietary practices, in terms of professions. It's constantly coming back again and again, and so it is very important to note that. And even around questions of disability, there is a very important resonance here, right? Like, just as the question of divinity and kinder kind of dovetail together, we know that the current government has kind of eschewed with the political category of disabled, and it advocates for the term Divyang, and Divyang as someone who is sacred. So the disabled body is a sacred body, therefore who needs rehabilitation and not rights. So then the transness, the divinity of transness and the divinity of disability kind of has very interesting connotations. And of course, for a long time, the trans body has been thought of as a defective body, and that in that way also disability is very much has been present in trans discourses. So yes, absolutely, there are multiple forms of intersections.
And if I could just add on something to that as well, I just was thinking about how, it is important actually in thinking about the history of criminalization in the late 19th century, right, and into the late colonial period, that it's very much interlinked with caste marginalization, right? So, and most obviously because so-called eunuchs were criminalized under Part 2 of the Criminal Tribes Act, right? The first part of the Criminal Tribes Act was criminalizing socially marginalized groups who were like very diverse, but were often low caste or considered untouchable, or were, considered nomadic, and in certain regions, groups that would be considered Adivasi or would identify as Adivasi as well. So, that the sort of relationship between social and legal practices of caste marginalization and then the criminalization of gender non-conforming people and bodies, that's actually been like intertwined for many decades, right, in different ways. And I think often, that's a really great point about like the defective body, the abnormal body has been really central to a lot of those 19th century, particularly late 19th century accounts, right? And that certainly I think is important to think with in terms of disability. and crip theory, right? And that sort of resistance against the notion of a normal body, right?
Yeah, I think to sum it up, efficiently, there are many contestations. Like even when we look at history of trans rights in this country, especially with the Criminal Rights Act, and there are many contestations even now on, as we have covered in the discussion until now. So I'll open the floor to questions now. If anyone has got any questions from the audience, feel free to ask.
So while some questions flow in, I kind of had one. So I'll begin the process. And please don't take this wrongly. It's may sound slightly awkward. So I was thinking now that queer and trans events in India, as well as festivals and other such programs, receive increasing amounts of funding and more global solidarity from different organizations. Does it, as well as the decriminalization of Section 377, Transgender Rights Act, creating the sort of image of a progressing state in that way overall, has sort of de-radicalized the queer trans political movement in some ways. Say the way Ahmedabad Pride or Mumbai Pride have outrightly banned political solidarity as part of the queer trans program. And has it changed the rhetoric of queer trans politics to one of Indian integration rather than one of changing India into a more accepting, more utopian society in that sense? Whatever your thoughts are. I have a slight follow-up question to this. If you want, I can ask that later. Anyone?
Yeah, just like yeah, I here also I think my response would be like, it's a little more complicated than that, in the sense that what has been interesting to note, like if you look at the like in India, for instance, it's been interesting to note, like even as so-called legal recognition is coming, like as we covered in the last 1.5 hours, that it's also complicated, that it's not really recognition, or it's not really rights, but it's limited by various constraints. Even as that is happening, what has been interesting is that funding, like the funding that you were mentioning, is actually shrinking. So in the 90s, when there wasn't any legal recognition or conversation, but with the HIV epidemic, there was a lot of transnational funding that came to the global south, right? And because of which a lot of community-based organizations started. Now, as limited as the mandate of these organizations were, because of the legibility and funding politics and who are the more vulnerable and all of that, but these organizations were also able to kind of have critical conversations around gender and sexuality, right? And so and it is because of these kind of conversations that were happening that we had like the NAS petition against Section 377, or like a lot of quote unquote mainstreaming of LGBT movements. But that funding started eventually disappearing. And so many of these organizations which started in the 90s and early 2000s are no longer functioning, because they were really dependent on this kind of funding, and they were not able to become autonomous without their funding, which kind of exposes the limits of NGOization as well. Now that funding kind of dried up, and then the other things that happened was that in this particular regime, like the government that we have right now, a lot of critical human rights language kind of is also tied to the funding that was coming into the country, right? So which is why the government really made the Foreign Currency Regulation Act far more stringent, because of which many community-based organizations are no longer able to accept transnational funding anymore. And because of which, like during the COVID pandemic, right, like many organizations which were kind of they could receive a lot of funding from outside India around the pandemic, could not receive funding, because how would a community-based organization show GST or vouchers? So there were a lot of infrastructural constraints because of which they could not receive the funding that they could have, and so they are really struggling as we speak. And many organizations which were doing quote unquote human rights work have actually had to shut down. So famous example of that would be Greenpeace, for example, right, which has been working on environment rights, or an organization like Lawyers Collective, which fought the famous case around patenting of HIV medicine. It has had so many enforcement directorate raids on their offices, and it has severely curtailed its capability to continue working. So then it is mostly the big organizations which are able to kind of provide the kind of documents that FCRA requires, that are still able to receive funding, whereas a lot of grassroots organizations that were actually doing the critical conversations around gender and sexuality are not being able to do that anymore. So it is always a paradoxical situation. So legal recognition, yes, but in terms of actual conversations on rights, not so much so. So it is a constant back and forth that's been going on. And even as we speak, something interesting has happened. The government of India is also defunding it has severely curtailed its funding around HIV over the years, and that cuts have been happening significantly. Antiretroviral therapy, which is freely available, which is supposed to be freely available in public hospitals, but during the pandemic, many of the hospitals did not receive supplies. So many individuals from the trans communities, queer communities have not been able to access ART during the pandemic, and often in public hospitals there is acute shortage of medicines which are supposed to be freely available. So there is that larger sheen of rights and of the state progressing, but actually if one goes into the finer details, it is far more complicated than that.
Wow, that was slightly concerning. That was slightly concerning if I really say anything about it. There is a very long question which I do not think will show up on screen, and I think I'm going to try to see if I can find the rest of it, because part of it seems to have been eaten up by the software. Till then, Shrutidhara P. Mohar has a question here. This is definitely related to an expanding discourse of rightlessness, if we borrow from Upendra Bakshi, isn't it? Regarding today's entire discussion.
I'm trying to formulate a response, I guess, to this question, but I'm also thinking about the previous question a little bit. And I also think, that image of a progressive state, right, with decriminalization of homosexuality, with recognition of the trans category and of gender self-identification, I think that image of India has transnationally circulated in some interesting and also sometimes concerning ways as well. And I sort of say this being, living in Singapore, right? And having seen then the way that in particular the Section 377 decision was sort of read and interpreted and then sort of entered into the public discourse here about the equivalent law in Singapore, Section 377A, which is actually a bit different, but criminalizes homosexuality. And this idea I think it's also the construction of a progressive nation, right, in these terms, right, and that sort of in many ways a sort of teleological construction, right, of history and of progression, which is obviously it's a a very useful idea, but it's also like a very simplistic, of course, an idea that sort of is teleological, right? And I mean, I'm thinking of this especially because this year Singapore has announced that it will decriminalize homosexuality, but will amend the law to make it clear that marriage is only between a person identified by the state as a male and a person identified by the state as a female. So so I think that image of India definitely did get a lot of reception within the region, right? And I think in part like this idea of like, at least here, this idea of India as being somehow more modern than Singapore was like a lot of the edge to that discussion, right, as well. So there's a certain geopolitics that's constructing that too. But yeah, I think that wasn't a direct answer to the question. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Sayan.
That totally reminds me of some of the media coverage and some of the writings after the Section 377 verdict came, right? Like it is India's decolonization moment. Like this whole way the discourse of decolonization was being marshaled around the Section 377 verdict, whereas if one actually goes into the fine print of the verdict and compares it to some of the other, like if one looks into the petitions that were filed in this particular judgment and compares with some of the other petitions that were filed earlier. So the NAS petition was based around questions of HIV, questions of rights and stigma. Whereas this particular one was basically more around questions of respect and meritocracy and the economic costs of homophobia. So the question of rights really shifted to one of empowerment, and that has been a really interesting move, right? Like, so I'm reminded of, and this.
I think we lost Shan again. I think they'll be back in a bit.
Someone talked about the paradigm of rights and rightlessness in the comment box, and it kind of goes to that. Like I'm reminded of this speech that Amit Shah gave, the Home Minister of the country gave, like human rights is a Western import. And so that question, and so why rights is such a trigger word. I mean, so far as academics, as activists, we have been very critical of the paradigm of human rights because we've been talking about who is really the subject of rights, right? And that question continues to be still very relevant. Like in a caste-based society, who is really the legible body that can have rights or that can become a citizen is a question that we have been grappling with for so long. Right, and then we come to this political point where the word rights itself has become a trigger word, and so then so then whatever little one had in the like in the 90s and 2000s is something that one is almost like there is this almost seduction of looking back at that period with some kind of a romantic nostalgia, even though we know that that period also had its severe limitations in terms of funding politics. But right now, even the word right, like the various non-profits and community-based organizations, when they have to write for grants, they have to constantly, formulate the language in terms of thinking about empowerment, in thinking about rehabilitation. And there, that question of selfhood and autonomy are often not, they cannot be written about because of strategic requirements. So does that really dovetail into questions of rightlessness entirely? I'm not sure, because I think there is a constant toggling between rights and rightlessness. And sometimes this discourse of empowerment becomes a way for communities to strategically get back some of the rights, even as severely limiting as it is.
Yeah, I think when it comes to rights, like I don't think in the Indian context we definitely do talk about rights even within the movements. It's more about empowerment and specifically economic empowerment over rights. that's what would be my observation and analysis from the movements here. Yeah, I think we don't have any other questions.
There's actually one last question. We don't really have time for many anymore. It's by Meghjit Sengupta, who's written, "Love the discussion. Really lucky to be an audience to such an engaging session. My question is, transmasculine people, politics, and bodies have hardly been under the purview of a colonial or even post colonial statist interpretation, either in terms of religious right wing notions of the Kinnar and also beyond the transnational fundings flowing in for MSMs or Kothis or transfeminine people. What are your thoughts on assigned female at birth transgender individuals, and has there been a history documented about them?"
I guess I can speak to my period, and I think again this is a question on which, I like. There certainly has been historical research done like prior to the 19th century, right? But really, a lot of the focus has been on the 19th century, and the archives to that period are really, as we've been talking about, very much preoccupied with transfemininity or with, I mean, broadly speaking. So I have often, I mean, I'm not necessarily surprised by this, but transmasculinity really doesn't emerge very much from the late 19th century archives that I have looked at. I have found a few articles in North Indian newspapers, Urdu and Hindi newspapers, that do have like that there were reports on women dressed as men, right, is how it's framed. And there's not very many. I mean, I'm thinking of one article that I came across more recently that was about a woman who was dressing as a man in order to be a teacher, and it was saying that we can't let such people around children, et cetera, and that's a pretty rare reference, right? From what I've found. So, I mean, I think the just because of the gender and sexual politics of both the colonial state and then of sort of like economically and caste dominant groups in the 19th century, there is a much greater preoccupation, right, with the hijra and with forms of transfemininity. But that's not to say that the histories of transmasculinity don't exist. I think it would be like a matter of looking to new types of sources or different types of sources and reading them in different ways as well. So yeah, that's my answer to that question, at least just from the archives that I've been looking at.
And that is such an important question, Meghdud. So if one looks at the queer mobilizations, contemporary queer mobilizations, one very
Yeah, I think Shan will be back in a bit.
the HIV discourse obviously does not necessarily address transmasculine concerns, right, or even lesbian concerns for that matter, which is why a lot of organizations started emerging across the country to address specific needs. So in the context of Western India, an organization like Stri Sangam, which later became Labia, or an organization like Sahatrika in Kerala, an organization like Vikalp in Gujarat, organization like Sappho in West Bengal, or Ukia in Assam, but also various other organizations right now that are emerging in Meghalaya and other states. Now, these organizations specifically have been addressing questions of of transmasculinity. And in their work, they have often found that, of course, transmasculine socialities have been there, have been around, and but without necessarily using these specific descriptors, right? So, for instance, in the work of Vikalp in Vadodara, they have done several fact findings where they have found that trans and lesbian coupledom in various Adivasi districts of Gujarat. They have and dating, and they have found letters, and they have had long conversations with transmasculine individuals who are now in their 50s. Now, what is, of course, because we live in a caste society, a patriarchal society, it again becomes a question of strategy, right? So how do we think about the health of transmasculine individuals or their specific needs? And often that kind of conversation gets co-opted under the conversation around reproductive health. And questions of family planning and bodily autonomy. So then the questions of health or transmasculine needs do not get the specific attention in the in the papers, but surreptitiously they still get addressed. But of course, a lot of work needs to be done, and now transmasculine groups which are also departing from LBT collective, saying that often lesbian feminists are not able to fully address their specific concerns. No, a lot of transmasculine groups are setting up their own groups, and like Sampurn is a network, right? And there is Tisar in West Bengal. There are several such groups are emerging, and with the emergence of more such groups, I think that there will be more work around both historical and contemporary work around questions of transmasculinity.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the question of transmasculine visibility, I think one key factor that we also need to look at is the male privilege or the sex-based privilege that like is often present in the society. And like if we have to think about a history of transmasculinity, then I think that is a big factor, considering like how not, like anyone who's assigned female at birth has been oppressed. Like yeah, I don't think we have any other questions. Mihir, do we?
No, we don't. That's all of them. And that's it. If you would like to end with anything you'd like to say.
I guess I'd just like to say thank you for having us, and thank you so much for like all the questions. And I think I've learned a lot tonight. So yeah, it's great. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mihir, Labonno, and everyone at Voyages. And thank you, Shakudi, for this great conversation and the great questions. I really look forward to the work that you will keep doing. And thank you, Jessica. It was great listening to you.
Yeah, lovely. I mean, as I said, I think I've learned a lot tonight, so it's great.
Yeah, thank you so much for like having me here, and it's been an awesome conversation, and also I learned a lot tonight. So yeah, thank you so much.
And I'd like to say the same. Thank you all for accepting the invitations and agreeing to attend and speak. It's been a wonderful session, and we hope for many such more in the future. And I guess a short thank you to all of our viewers, those who do remain. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your engagement with the material matter of today. And that brings us to an end. With that, good night, I guess.
Yeah. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Bye.